Hi, I'm Mike from Craft Supplies USA, and today I'm going to show you how to turn a coin box. It's a fun, modern design that goes well on your nightstand or your desk, and it makes storing your change nice and easy. The funneled lid design funnels all the change towards the center, and the reverse funnel on the lid makes getting the change out a breeze. So let's get to turning this, and let's have some fun. So I've got my 3-in-1 screw chuck here. That's what I'll be using to mount the blanks. And the blanks that I have today are going to be some 5-inch diameter maple by roughly 2 to 2.5. You can adjust the dimensions based on how big you want your change box to be. So go ahead and play around with that. As far as the picking out which blank I want for the base, I think this one has a little better figure in the top, and that's what I'll use for the lid. So this will be my base, and this will be the piece I put on first. So let's go ahead and mount our 3-in-1 screw chuck. This is a really convenient option for this. If you have a regular 4-jaw chuck with a woodworm screw, you can use that. One thing you'll want to make sure with the woodworm screws is that you use some shim stock, so that way that screw isn't sticking out too far. Go ahead and snug this up. I'm going to lock my spindle. Go ahead and make sure that's nice and snug. I'll bring over my tool rest, get my height set. I'm going to be just a hair below center, and what I want to do now is I want to rough this out to round. I want to maintain as much of the diameter of this piece as possible and stay as close to that 5 inches as I can. I will be using a VM120 with 5-inch bowl jaws, so I want to stick as close to this size as possible. If I start reducing that diameter, then I'll have to switch my jaws out that I plan on using. So let's go ahead and rough this out to round. Go ahead and spin that, make sure it clears by hand, and whenever I start a new piece on the lathe, I like to start the lathe and then slowly bring that piece up to speed. For a piece this size, I'm going to be about 1200 RPM. You can turn it a little slower if you'd like, but 1200 RPM is going to cut efficiently for me, and it's a good safe turning speed. So I've got my 1/2-inch bowl gouge, so it's a 5/8 bar. We're going to go ahead and rough this out, starting with the flute slightly closed and the handle a little bit at my hip here. Remember, we want to slow down as soon as we get to the end of the cut here so those fibers don't blow out. You can see the curls we're getting there. We're getting a good clean cut. I kind of screwed that up on the end there, just trying to grab the shavings. So if I put my hands on the piece, I can feel it still out around a little bit. There's a flat spot. So I feel just a little bit of a flat spot still. Yeah, right there. So about another 1/16 or less, we should be good. Go ahead and pick up that cut and ride the bevel. And then slow down as we end the cut. Alright, so that's nice and flat. I'm going to go ahead and give myself a tenon for my chuck. So I'm going to rotate my tool rest around just a hair. And this will be a peel cut, so I'm going to roll that flute basically completely closed, and I'll be cutting on the underside of the wing here. And because of the nose of this tool is quite large, I'm not able to get a nice clean crisp angle on the inside for my tenon. So I'm going to switch to my spindle gouge. And I'll be using this because it's got a nice long bevel on there. I can get into that corner and give myself a nice clean corner and a better gripping surface for my chuck. So you can see I'm cutting this direction, then I rotate that tool over and cut into that corner, and that gives me a nice clean taper for my chuck jaws. So I'm going to stop the lathe. I'm going to get my chuck here, open up the jaws, and just do a test fit. All right, so this fits on there really good. You can see I've got about a 1/2 inch gap between the jaws. I don't want to reduce that tenon anymore. If I did, it would give me a better gripping strength. Because this is a working fit and it will be compressing the fibers a bit, I want to leave enough material there to turn it away to leave a clean surface and get rid of the indentations from the chuck jaws. So that tenon I'm pretty happy with. So we're going to go ahead and take this off. And go ahead and lock my spindle now. This piece was dimensional lumber, so the base of it's really flat. I don't need to true this up, but if you did have a piece that wasn't flat on the bottom, go ahead and square that up before you take it off. So let's go ahead and remove that screw chuck and set it aside because we'll be using this again on the lid. Alright, so we took off the 3-in-1 screw chuck. Go ahead and put your 4-jaw chuck on the lathe. Whenever you seat these, go ahead and give it a little flick at the end, make sure it seats correctly. That way the chuck doesn't unscrew itself when you turn the lathe off in the end and the motor breaks itself. Then go ahead and tighten this up. Make sure you tighten both pinion gears. And you should be set. So now what we need to do as far as the base process, we have our tenon. We're going to go ahead and hollow out the inside and give ourselves a little bit of a concave rim here, and then we'll be mounting the lid and then jam chucking this to finish the exterior. But right now we're just going to go ahead and clean out the inside and get our overall dimension on the interior turned. So I'm going to go ahead and get my tool rest set up. Make sure that tool rest is locked in there right, and then I just adjust this out of the way so I'm not bumping into it. But go ahead and make sure that turns correctly. Then we can go ahead and turn the lathe on. So right now I can feel the face of this piece is a little bit out of square, so I want to square this up, and then we can go ahead and hollow out the inside. Before I make the cut, make sure your flute is completely closed. If I go in there with this flute open, it's going to dig in really bad, and it could have the piece come out of the chuck. So make sure your flute's closed. And go ahead and just square up the piece. The reason you square up the face of a piece before you hollow it out is if the piece is not square, when you go to make that cut and you make bevel contact, it's going to be skipping off that face that's out of true, and it's going to have a hard time riding the bevel and making that cut entry. So if you have a piece that's out of square, you go to make a cut and it'll start kicking the tool around and you could have a catch. So make sure this is nice and square before you go and hollow out the box. When we're making that entry cut, I want that flute completely closed, which is going to be facing away from me. Once my bevel is established and I'm riding on the bevel, then I can open up the flute a little bit and make that cut. If I go in there with the flute open, it's going to skate on me, and you can see it just kicks it all the way back, and that's what we don't want to have happen. So make sure that bevel is closed, or sorry, the flute's closed until you're on the bevel there, and then open it up, and then you can make the cut. I know it's happened to me, but when I've gone to make a final finishing cut on a bowl, I've had that flute just a little too far open, and then it skates across that surface that was almost finished, and then I didn't have enough material left to get through those tear out marks. One thing I didn't mention earlier is that the orientation of the grain on this piece is just like a bowl. So as far as turning, it's basically turning a bowl. If you watched our utility box video, basically the exact same process for the base. So grain orientation is running up and down. I've got my end grain fibers just like this. So as I'm making the cut, all the fibers are supported, and it's giving me a nice clean cut on the inside. And my goal right now is to get the bulk of the material out of the way before we go to a scraper, because it's going to be cutting a little easier with this tool than it will be the scraper. So you want to get rid of 80% of the material before you go to your scraper. If your tool rest is in the way, go ahead and slide that back a little ways. A swing away is really handy just to give yourself clearance for your tool handle, so you're not hitting that revolving center. All right, let's go ahead and check our depth and just see where we're at. Just go ahead and use a pencil, give yourself a rough line. So we're about halfway through the piece. I'll make a few more passes with the bowl gouge, and then we'll go to our scraper to establish our straight walls and then a straight base that we're going to want on the inside of the piece. So again, make sure that the flute is closed as you make the cut, and then once you're making bevel contact, you can go ahead and open that up. And I'm going to switch to my scraper now. This is just a box scraper with a slightly radius nose. One thing I've found that's handy when using a scraper or a carbide tool like this is I just keep my fingers up here to block the shavings so I can see what's going on and keep the shavings out of my face. So. As far as my height on the tool rest, my cutting edge is a little bit above center, and that's because I want to raise the handle just so it's a little less aggressive, so that's why it's slightly raised. So that catch I had there was the bottom of the tool contacting the sidewall and kind of pushing my tool out of the way. So what I had to do is I rotated the tool slightly towards me so that the cutting edge was left of the bottom wing here. A lot of times if the tool thickness, usually it'll be in the way depending on how tight of a curve you have for your piece. So if that starts happening, just roll the tool over and that'll give you a little more clearance, or you can give yourself a relief grind on the side. And right now I'm just stepping this down to get rid of that bulk. Let's go ahead and check our depth. Alright, so we're about 1/8 of an inch past where we were. For my final depth, I want to be right about here, about a quarter inch of material in the base, and then we'll have 1/4 to 3/8 or so on the wall thickness as well. If you're getting a little too aggressive, you can see the tool starts to get a little grabby. That's why I've got my arm on top of the handle, just in case. I don't want that tool handle coming up and hitting me in the face. So make sure that tool handle's supported. Right now I am working a ways over the tool rest, and we should probably adjust that. Get that as close as we can, give us a little extra support. I want to show you guys real quick, as far as scraping the inside of this, I never want to make my cutting edge go past center, because if I do, the tool will lift up because it's coming up on the upside. It'll lift the tool up and then slam it down on the tool rest. Let's go ahead and keep scraping out the material and get to our final depth. Let's go ahead and take a look here and see how we are. Alright, so there's the marks we had previous. So we're about just under a 1/2 inch left. I would say let's go ahead and remove 1/8 of an inch of material in the base, and then we'll go ahead and establish our rim diameter, which is actually going to be right about there. So that pencil mark is going to be where I want to be for my final size. I'm just using the side of the tool there to clear the shavings out because I can't see where my step is in the very bottom of the workpiece. It never hurts to have a little air compressor. You can blow out shavings out of pieces like this just so you can see what's going on. A lot of the times the shavings get stuck in the piece and then you can't see where you're cutting. So a little air compressor would be nice. Blow these out. While the lathe stopped, I'm going to go ahead and check my depth one more time. I think we're right about where we want to be, and we can go ahead and give ourselves a final cleanup cut. Alright, as soon as I get near the bottom, I slow the feed rate down. The reason I do that is because I'm going from contacting an 1/8 inch of cutting edge to about a 1/2 inch, and then it's going to get really grabby. So I slow the feed rate down and then ease into the base. I can't tell you how many times I've been advancing that cutter fairly quickly, and then I hit the base of the box and then it just catches really hard on you, especially if you have a nice fresh edge. So as soon as you know you're getting close to the base, slow the feed rate down and then just ease into contacting more cutting surface. Because my cutting edge is fairly dull after having roughed that out, I'm going to go hit the grinder and I'll be right back. Alright, so now I've got a nice fresh edge on my scraper. Now that we're getting to our final size, you definitely want to make sure your tools are sharp. That way we leave a clean surface and minimize the sanding time we have. You can see we have about an 1/8 inch of material left to remove on the wall thickness, and then we'll go ahead and clean up the face here and slightly concave that. You can see those marks we have from the skating catch I showed you. So let's go ahead and get our final wall diameter. We'll clean up the rim and then give ourselves a nice clean cut in the base. Make sure your arm's on top of the tool. And as I advance this, I want to make sure that my scraper is nice and parallel to the lathe bed. That way my walls are straight. I don't want to have walls that taper in or out on the inside of the box. If you need to, get yourself a good shop light so you can see what's going on inside the box. For me, I'm actually looking on this side of the piece to see what the cut's doing instead of looking down right at the cutting edge. I can see everything I need to on this other side of the piece. You could hear the sound change as soon as I got to the base. Make sure you slow the cut down as you contact that, especially if you're using a square end scraper, because you'll be going from contacting an 1/8 inch or whatever the cut width is to all of a sudden contacting the entire cutting surface. So make sure you slow that down as soon as you get to the base. Right now I'm just smoothing out the bottom, trying to give myself a nice clean cut. Clear out those shavings so you can see what's going on. All right, let's take a look and see what the surface looks like. All right, so I've got a little bit of some tool marks in the bottom. I'm going to smooth those out. And then it looks like the wall has a fair amount of tear out. The scraper's not cutting super clean on this, so I'll switch to a gouge and give myself a nice clean cut. But I want to establish the base before we switch tools. Alright, I think the base will give us a nice clean surface there. And now I'm going to switch to a 3/8 bowl gouge and try and give myself a nice clean cut. I want to make sure my flute's completely closed because right now I don't want this skating on the surface, as I don't have a lot of material left here to have to clean up if I do have a catch. So make sure that flute's completely closed. And then right now I want my bevel to be nice and parallel with the bedways. So that flat bevel right there, I want that to be in line with the bedways, and that's why my tool handle swung so far out. Getting a little bit of chatter as that gouge is getting farther and farther over the rest. But you can see we're getting a really good shaving. This is no longer a scrape. This is a nice clean cut. So I'm going to go ahead and clear that tool rest out of the way so you can see what surface we have. Because this is a slightly rounded nose compared to the scraper, I do have a little bit of a small radius in the corner. I'll touch that up with the scraper, but you can see the walls here are nice and clean now. There's basically no tear out. There are some bevel marks where I was pushing just a little too hard on the bevel, but those will sand out with 220 in just a few seconds. So the base here, you can see the inside is very clean. It's nice and smooth. You always want to check that to make sure you don't have a nub in the center or a high spot or a low spot. Usually what happens is as you come to the center, a lot of guys will stay there too long and it'll create a small little depression. So you want to make sure that's nice and flat. Let's go ahead and clean up the corner here, and then we can clean up the rim. So I'm going back to my scraper to give myself a clean shoulder. And that's all it takes. Whenever you drop your tools, you want to make sure you drop them handle down so you don't damage the cutting edge. So try that next time you're turning. If you're going to drop them, make sure you drop them handle down. Let's go ahead and clean up the rim here. I'll use the scraper, and I want this to be slightly tapered toward the inside. This inside edge will be just a hair lower than the exterior. The reason being is when these two parts fit together, if it tapers the opposite direction, I'm going to have a gap on the rim. So keep that in mind. I got to cut through that catch I had on the rim when the tool skated back on me. All right, that feels nice and smooth. Okay, we're just a hair over a 1/4 inch thick on the wall section. We got a nice clean cut. Let's go ahead and sand the interior and the rim. Then we can go ahead and flip this piece around. Move your tool rest and the banjo. For sanding, I'm going to be using the Abernet because it doesn't load up. I'll be sanding with 240 to start out with. I have a really clean surface. I think 240 might even be too aggressive for this. I don't want to leave a bunch of tool or sanding scratches behind that I don't need to. But I'll start out with 240 and see how it does. I'm going to drop my speed down as well. Sandpaper doesn't like high speeds, and the wood doesn't like a lot of heat. So slow the speed down, and you can tell if you're sanding at too high of a speed, the sandpaper's not cutting efficiently, and you can feel the difference. If you sit there rubbing the sandpaper, you can adjust the speed and feel when it starts grabbing and abrading the surface more, and that's always on the lower end of the speed. So if you want, go ahead and try it out for yourself and see what kind of speed ranges your sandpaper or you like. But we were at 1200 to turn and I'm about 800 to sand. So reducing my speed by about a third. So I can see there's just a small little shoulder there that the sanding dust revealed. I'm gonna throw my tool rest back in the banjo here and get my scraper back up and do one more cut just to clean that off. Turn my speed back up. That tool rest is way too low. It's a little grabby. So I was rotating the tool to try and just get the lead edge of this in there to make the cut. It kind of caught the wing and was grabbing on me a little bit. And I don't want to contact this wall right now because it had a really clean cut from the gouge. I'm going to drop that speed back down. So we got rid of that little step in the corner of the base. Then we'll go ahead and just sand this out. Depending on the size of your piece and the length of your drill, you might be able to get in there with a drill and sand that a little faster. This is just a 2-inch disc holder. The reason I went to this is because I can sand it much quicker with a power drill. And the other reason being too is a lot of times when you're sanding into a box like that, the sandpaper will catch and then spin your hand around inside, and it's not super comfortable, so I like going to a drill as much as I can on a piece like this. I'm going to sand just a hair more on the wall section here, and then we can go to our finer grits. Obviously, whenever you're sanding, make sure you wear a respirator, have some good dust extraction. If we had a good way to pick up audio with a dust mask on, we would do it, but for you guys, I'll not sand with a dust mask. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and sand the rim here. And then this is just a little bit of a sharp edge on the inside, so I'm just going to touch it. Just soften that up a hair. Alright, so now I'm at 320. Give that sandpaper a little flick to unload it. Give you a nice fresh cutting edge. Sand the rim. And then I'll switch to my 320. Don't spend too much time power sanding the center of a piece like that because it'll wallow it out and leave a depression. Alright, so now that we've sanded through 320, I want to go ahead and inspect the surface. Looks like it's doing really good. We don't have any tear out. I'm going to go to 400 on my last grit, and then we can flip this piece around. On this piece, it's going to be a little bit of a different finishing process. I will be putting some dye on it like this piece has here. This is the same maple but with a artisan dye on it. And I'm not going to put the scratch free on this piece like I normally would because I don't want to have to strip the wax out of it later with some denatured alcohol. So I'm going to be using a non-woven scuff pad. Basically, this is 2500 grit. This will burnish the surface kind of like steel wool. So I'm going to use that for my final grit. I like steel wool, but at the same time I don't. A lot of times it gets caught on the workpiece I'm using or the chuck, and then it tears it apart, as well as sometimes it'll stain the piece. If you're using a really light colored piece, steel wool sometimes will leave a steel dust behind. That'll get stuck into, if you have any tear out, it'll really accentuate the tear out with some metal dust. So I've kind of gone away from steel wool and gone to these non-woven pads. But that is done. So we've got a nice clean surface there. There's a tiny touch of tear out. I'm actually going to go back to my 400 grit and spot sand that. There we go. Looks like there's a little bit right here as well. It's interesting too how sometimes tear out doesn't show up until the very last grit. You don't really notice it until the rest of the surface is kind of burnished. But you can always go back and spot sand it. Okay. Let's go ahead and remove this from the chuck. So now we've got the interior complete. The dye will be put on after the entire project is turned and sanded. We'll do that just on the lathe bed with the dye and the finish. But the interior is done. We have a nice concave rim here. Our overall thickness is just over 1/4 of an inch. And our depth is nice and good. That'll hold a lot of change. So let's go ahead and mount up our lid, and then we'll use that as a jamb chuck to finish the exterior of our base and then turn off our tenon as well. If you got a good lockup with your chuck and the spindle, you'll know because you'll need your key to get it off. If you can remove the chuck without using a key or a lever bar, you know you need to tighten it up a little more. So we're going to go back to our 3-in-1 screw chuck. Turn the speed down as low as it goes. And then I'm going to hold the piece just like this. Once it's started on the screw, and then as soon as it hits the base, just let it take it out of your hands. Then you can lock your spindle and then just snug everything up. So as far as our lid design goes, what we want to do now is we want to go ahead and turn the concave interior. The reason that's concave is because when I flip my change jar over, if I have a nice tight fit, which is what I usually want. I want a little tighter fit than just kind of a press fit. I want to be able to flip it over and have the change funnel itself out into, you know, a bag you can take to the bank. So I'm going to go ahead and concave this surface. I'll be turning the step that fits inside the box. We'll be turning our relief cut, which is more of a design thing, because if these two pieces warp differently, having a nice little break there gives me a visual break to where you don't notice it out of round if it does move. And then once we have that turned, we'll flip it around and then turn the exterior concave face as well. So kind of a lot of steps on the lid, but it'll be pretty easy and simple once you see how we do it. Go ahead and move your drill out of the way. And for this project, we really aren't using the tailstock much. We will be using it once we jam fit the base onto the lid section. But for right now, the tailstock is just going to stay out of the way. As far as fitting my tenon and my jamb chuck here, what you can do is we'll give ourselves a little bit of a cone shape and find out where our diameter is a quick and easy way to establish diameters. And sorry, I actually forgot. I want to go ahead and square this up before we do that. So I'm going back to my bowl gouge. And same thing, I want to maintain as much of the material here as possible, so we're going to where it's just round. Bring up that speed to about 1200. Flute's fairly closed. Slow down as you hit the end there, you don't want to blow these fibers out. All right, we're very close now. Take a nice easy cut. You can see the shavings we're getting are nice and clean, nice clean cut. Slow down. And now our blank is nice and square, nice and round. The cut we had there was nice and clean as well. So to fit my jamb chuck, I'm going to turn a slight taper and we'll find out where this matches up. flute is completely closed now because now we're doing a peeling cut because we're hitting side grain. And this is just kind of a quick way of finding out where the fit is. I've given myself a nice tapered nose there, and then I can hold the piece up and see where the burnishing mark is. That was rubbing on the inside of the rim here, and that's where I need to make my cut. I'm going to just establish that just a little bit darker. You don't want to hold it on there too long either because it will burn the inside rim of this and it stands out and doesn't look very good. But now we at least have a rough idea of where the inside of that piece needs to be. Let's see if that was the inside mark or the outside. Okay, that's very close. So what I want to do, because this is going to be a working fit, I want to be able to hold the base on there without the tailstock as much as I can. So I want this to be a nice press fit, something I actually have to put a lot of pressure on to get it to fit tight. And whenever you're getting that fit, I want that tenon to be slightly barrel shaped. So it's got a high center and then kind of tapers off at the ends. That'll give me a nice, really good hold. Usually, a lot of times these tenons will be slightly tapered and they don't hold as good as they need to, and then the piece will pop off. So if you have a little bit of a barrel shape to it, that'll be a good tenon. And I will go from that bowl gouge, I'm going to switch to my spindle gouge just so I can have a little more control as to what's going on here and get into those angles that I need to. This size of a gouge is just a little too bulky to get into those corners that I need to. So right now I've got the flute completely closed in this direction, that way I'm riding on the bevel, because it'll do the same thing. If I have this too open, it'll skate on me towards the center. So make sure that flute's closed over. Remove just a hair of material there because we were very close to our fit. Alright, so now it's going on. It's a good fit there, and now I'm going to establish the length of tenon. Now that I have my diameter, I'm going to go ahead and establish the length I need. So I'm going to use the bigger gouge just to get rid of some of that bulk. And then we'll come back in with the spindle gouge to clean that up and give us a nice fit. I think I might have undersized that tenon just a hair. Okay, that's a nice tight fit. It might be too tight. I don't want to force it on and split the piece. So what I'm doing is just tapping this piece with the gouge, and that'll usually let this piece come off. If that's not doing it, go ahead and just grab it, and you can pop it off. You can see we've got a really tight fit there, and honestly that's kind of what we want because we are going to be turning this without the tailstock in place. I'll be using my spindle gouge to peel off just a tiny bit more material to where it's not such a pressure fit because I don't want to split this piece. Again, flute's closed. Go ahead and check the fit now. Alright, so you can see the fit now is too loose. The piece is wobbling on there. I just turned too much material away, and it made even just that hair of fiber we took off was too much, and now the fit went from being too tight to now it's too loose. So what I'm going to do is extend the tenon just a little bit further and leave it a little oversized, and see if we can get a tight enough fit if we extend that just a hair. So I extended that tenon about 1/8 of an inch. close. It's not quite small enough to fit the piece. That's a bit of a problem. So that's still too loose. Let's go ahead and extend that tenon just a little further. This isn't ideal, but if I look at my tenon, it tapers. So the biggest diameter is here, and it tapered toward the center. What happened is I had my bevel pointed towards the spindle, and then it reduced the diameter as I went. So I'm actually going to remove some of the bulk here. And just shorten that up a little ways. And fortunately, this blank is long enough. I've got enough material I can have a little room for error there, which is actually pretty fortunate on this piece right now. So I'm making sure that this is tapering up and getting bigger as it goes. That way I don't have the same issue I just had on that first tenon I tried to make. Okay, so now we got a nice tight fit again. That's definitely too tight. So fingers crossed, I'm gonna remove some material here and get the perfect fit we need. Some days you chase these fits and you just never get them, and that's when it's time to go inside and watch TV. All right. All right, that's looking pretty good. I'm just gonna rotate it and tap it on as I go. This is about as tight as I would want this to be. Any tighter, I risk splitting the piece. If you have your shop mallet from one of our other project videos, little shop mallet's always nice to have. Okay, so the fit we have on this is tight enough that I can go ahead and turn this unsupported as long as I'm fairly careful and not getting a lot of catches. But it's definitely tighter than what we're gonna want for a final fit. I want this to be kind of a press fit, but not too tight. So what we wanna do now is establish our overall exterior surface. So imagine the piece like this. I wanna go ahead and even this up and get it nice and flat and get it sanded. And then we're gonna turn our tenon down to remove the tool marks and get our overall size of the tenon, as well as put our decorative marks and concave that surface slightly. So on this piece, obviously we'll be putting the die on later, but we can go ahead and put our decorative rings in as well. If you want to, you can bring up the tailstock and support your piece. If your tenon wasn't really tight, go ahead and support it. But this piece is tight enough for now. The other thing too is I'm not removing a lot of material at this stage, so I'm not worried about the fit I have and the hold. We're just taking very light cuts to even up the surfaces and establish that exterior diameter. I want to make sure that this is fairly flat. I want a nice uniform surface. So go ahead and look over the horizon line on the top, eyeball it, and see how much material you need to remove. It was just a little high on this end. I can see I've got a low spot right here in the center, and then it kind of tapers up towards the spindle here. So I think we're close enough though that we can shear scrape this to get our final shape, and then we can go ahead and size the tenon, or sorry, size the base. So I'm going to switch to a different bowl gouge. This has a nice long wing on it, I can shear scrape with. And I'm going to raise the tool rest a ways to shear scrape a fair amount above center. The reason being is if you main that tool rest height where we had it for the regular turning, when you shear scrape, there's a lot of tool over the tool rest and you get a fair amount of chatter. So raise that tool rest up, that way the cutting edge is more supported. You can see the shavings we're getting off there are very fine curls. It's leaving us a very clean surface. Go ahead and take a look. Yeah, we're getting a nice surface, and now we just want to minimize the tool marks we had from before and then make sure this is as flat as possible. I can see right here on the end it was kind of high, so I'm just trying to bring that down in line with the low spot we had. I'm just trying to have a nice steady feed rate as far as moving the tool across the surface. And as soon as you feel the edge come off that wing, rotate the tool over and then cut towards the headstock. Because now I've got a nice fresh cutting edge here we haven't used. Got a bit of a high spot right here, that's why I'm just trying to work this down. Alright, let's see how our surface is looking here. Alright, that looks really good. There's a couple spots with tear out. Just a few spots. It's a little wavier than I'd like, but that'll sand out no problem. Let's go ahead and establish the base here and remove the tool marks we have in the tenon from the chuck. I'm using a 3/8 spindle gouge just because the shorter bevel, the 35-degree bevel angle on here gives me more clearance to get in there and to make the curves that I need. Just going to move my other tools out of the way so I'm not running into the tool handles. Again, make sure your flute's closed over. You can see how it caught on me there a little bit. As I was saying, close the flute over, I had it way too open. Make sure that thing's rolled over all the way. Because right now we're in the finishing stages of the base. You don't want to be having catches here because there's not enough material to turn them out and still have a nice box. Make sure that flute's completely closed before you start. And I need to drop this tool rest. I forgot to lower that. That's probably part of the reason I had that catch there as well. Slow down as I get the tip of the tool into that corner. Alright, let's take a look and see if we removed the compression marks. That looks pretty good. I just need to clean up the corner a hair, and then we can go ahead and concave the base. Make sure my flute's closed over. I don't want to be really aggressive here because we still are on a pressure fit and we're unsupported. This is more of a peel cut. Had a little bit of a catch there as I went to move the tool out of the way. Alright, so that's nice and concave. There's a tiny bit of a nub there, and I could smooth this out a little bit, but the sanding disc, because we're going to be using a drill, will give me exactly what I want to get out of that surface. So I'm just going to make sure that the rim here is concave, that way the base doesn't rock on me. Alright, that's a good surface. Now that we know we have clean cuts all across this piece, no tear out, nice clean surface, now we're going to go ahead and power sand this. I'm going to drop my speed down. Get my sandpaper. The reason I'm power sanding the exterior is one, because it's quicker, but two, because this disc holder will give me a nice flat surface instead of the undulations I'll get from having my fingers on a piece of paper. Test the piece, make sure it's not getting too hot, otherwise you're going to have some heat checking. Okay, that's feeling pretty good. I'm going to sand the base. I'm just going to adjust my disc on the holder here. It was slightly offset, and that would have melted the Velcro and the disc would come off. So okay, and then we're going to have to switch back to our paper. For the inside of the corners here, the disc holder is not going to get in there. And because we will be dyeing this piece later, you really want to make sure you don't have any tear out, because the dye just accentuates the tear out. Any torn grain really stands out with dye on it. So I may have a good example of that later on in the video, we'll see. But I think we got rid of all the tear out on this piece. So okay, there's a little bit right here. I'm just going to spot sand this before we jump up and grit. Okay, that's looking pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and switch to my next grit. I started with 220, now I'm going to 320. Grab my 320 paper. Yeah, so the drill I'm using, I'm going full speed on it. It's not a very fast drill, it's just your regular standard drill. I'd recommend an angled head drill. Those are a little bit better, a little more controllable. That's just what I had on hand. Go ahead and get in there and get those angles. Alright, so now that was 400. I'm going to go ahead and switch to my non-woven pad. just to burnish the surface a little bit. And you can actually see the shine off the piece increasing as you burnish it. It's kind of cool. Now I'm going to go ahead and add my decorative grooves in the base, as well as chamfer both these corners. On this piece in particular, I like having chamfered corners. I think it gives it a nice little touch, as well as no one likes picking up a piece that feels sharp. So to do that, I'll be using my skew. I'm going to bump my speed back up now. I'm going to match the rings we have on the base. And then we'll just chamfer these corners. The reason I do this after I sand is if I did the chamfered and then sanded them, it would round them over and soften them up too much, and it doesn't look as clean as making those cuts after you sand. So from there, I'll just be using that non-woven pad on the areas we just chamfered. And this piece, the base, is done. Now it's ready to take off the lathe. If it's really tight, go ahead and tap the piece that's in the screw chuck. You can see we've got a gap starting there now. It's coming off. There we go. So the base is ready for some dye. So now the base is complete. We've got a nice interior, slightly concave rim again. Nice exterior ready for dye, and this piece is ready for the top. So as far as turning the top goes, this is how the piece is oriented right now. So we've got our tenon here. I'm going to turn a relief cut for a decorative groove, and then we'll go ahead and concave the inside of the rim. So let's go ahead and get our tool rest back up. Give that a quick spin, make sure everything clears. We can go ahead and turn the lathe on. Speed, we're going to bump back up to about 1300 RPM. And I'm going to shorten up this tenon. I don't need it that long. A 3/8 tenon is plenty. So what I've done here is I've removed a lot of the material, I've shortened up my tenon, but I've left this surface nice and flat. The reason being is I'll be using a Forstner bit to drill this out. If I concave that then try to drill it with the Forstner, it would go off center and could cause injury, it could hurt you, it could come out of the drill chuck. So make sure that the surface that you're going to drill with a Forstner is nice and flat. So I want to go ahead and establish that and drill this out, and then we can go ahead and give ourselves the concave rim. I'm going to bring up my tailstock. I'm going to take out the revolving center and put in my Forstner bit in a keyless drill chuck, and this is an 1.25 inch bit. I found it'll fit the $50, the dollar coins, and pretty much every other coin out there. So the other nice thing is it's basically like a 1/3, 2/3 on the hole diameter to the overall diameter, so it looks more aesthetically pleasing. Bring up your tailstock with the Forstner bit, and then turn on the lathe, and we're going to drop that speed down to roughly 700 RPM. Before we drill this, I want to go ahead and mark where the end of the screw is in the screw center chuck, and this was my depth stop, so now I can hold this up against the piece and mark where the end of that screw is, because I don't want to contact that with my Forstner bit. Make sure your tailstock's locked down, and slowly. Alright, I want to show you something interesting. So right now as I went to make that cut, with the Forstner bit, it started to go off center slightly, and you can see right now the bit's wobbling pretty bad. So I'm actually going to bring this out completely out of the way, and I'm gonna give myself a new center point. It's weird, sometimes you go to use a Forstner bit and it'll go right in, no problem, drilled perfectly straight, which is most of the time, but other times it'll just hit something that causes that to wobble a little bit. So I went and cleared that off, gave myself a nice concentric funnel for the bit to center on. And now it's wobbling, but not as bad as it was. And right now I'm just checking my depth. Bring my finger up there. Let's just see where we're at. If you want to, you could definitely have used some tape on your drill bit. All right, so I got about 1/8 of an inch to go. And that's as far as I want to go. I want to make sure I don't contact that screw, because the screw is hardened. So be careful there. And now we're going to move our tailstock out of the way. We're going to keep the Forstner bit in there because we will be using that in just a minute. But now we can go ahead and give ourselves that nice tapered cone on the inside. Bring your speed back up from the drilling speed back to 1300 RPM. I'm going to switch back to my regular grind on the bowl gouge. So this peel cut right now doesn't give me a very clean surface because now I'm cutting up into the end grain fibers, and you can see the tear out we're getting. So once I remove the bulk that direction, I'm going to flip the gouge over and cut from the rim towards the center. Because now the fibers are supported. I'll show you the difference too in the surfaces here. So you saw the surface we had before when I was peel cutting towards me. The surface was all torn out, and now we've got a really good surface, and there's just some tool marks from the bevel. So I'm going to concave that just a little bit more, and then we'll be able to go ahead and flip that around. If the gouge is leaving too many tool marks, you're probably pushing too hard, or what you can do is switch to a smaller bowl gouge. I'm going down to that 3/8 now. And because it's a smaller gouge, I need to bring my tool rest in to give me a little more support. But this smaller cutting edge and the contact patch will give me a cleaner surface and help prevent those tool marks. So those are terrible cuts that I just made there. I want to pick up a clean one. And ride that down to the center. So now you can see what we have is a very smooth surface, nice clean cut. And then that is ready to sand. So we're going to go ahead and sand our tenon just a little bit. I'm actually going to scrape this just a little bit with my skew because that fit was so tight on there. That's not what I want when the piece is finished. So I'm going to go ahead and loosen that up just a hair while we're here. Using my skew laid flat like a negative rake scraper. And cleaning up that surface as well. All right, before you remove too much material, make sure you test fit it. All right, that's perfect. Something I can put on there without too much pressure, but it'll still be a kind of a press fit. That's perfect. Now I want to establish the little step I've got there. That'll help prevent if the two pieces warp slightly, you won't notice it because there's a nice break in the surface, as well as it gives it just a nice decorative band. I'll be using the skew for that as well, about an 1/8 inch deep, 1/8 inch wide. All right, let's go ahead and put that up there and see how that looks. That gives us a good decorative break in the surface, especially where these two pieces aren't identical and we don't have a grain match. That nice decorative break there helps that out. All right, let's go ahead and sand the inside here, the 2 steps, and then we can go ahead and flip the piece around. Drop my speed back down and move the tool rest out of the way. Go back to my 220. Go ahead and hit this with 320 now. We had such a clean surface off the tool, it really doesn't require a lot of sanding. That's really all that needs. Now we'll go ahead and sand our tenon slightly. And then that decorative shoulder. All right, now we can go ahead and remove that from the 3-in-1 screw chuck because we'll be gripping on this surface with our chuck. Oh yeah, we got a really clean surface there. Nice tenons. That should just drop in there. Go ahead and get our 4-jaw chuck. Let's go ahead and mount our 4-jaw chuck. We'll take our lid and mount it on that tenon we had for the base. Alright, and because I do have a fairly big gap in the jaws, it will be leaving some teeth marks if I get too crazy on the pressure. But I'll show you how to clean those up if you do have those. I'm going to square the surface off just a hair so we can go ahead and use our Forstner bit to drill out the rest of the hole. Tool rest was just a little high. Just squaring up that surface. I'm going to move my tool rest out of the way and bring the tail stock into place. Lock it down and then we'll drop our speed again for drilling. Anytime I drill on the lathe, I want to have my quill lock be tight enough I can still advance the piece. Or sorry, tight enough that this isn't wobbling, but loose enough that I can still advance it. There is a fair amount of play in every quill out there, some worse than others. But I want to be able to move it forward and back, but be nice and snug as I do it. And because we're going into the hole we had for the screw chuck, it might not center up as well as you want. So just be careful on your entry cuts and make sure everything's going square before you get too crazy with your feed rate. And what I want to do now is, because I'm drilling into my chuck jaws here, I want to be very careful as to how far my Forstner bit goes in. Because we drilled from the backside, there will be a point where there's just a little thin wafer of wood between the bit and the hole we already drilled, and you'll hear the sound change as soon as the bit contacts that, and that's where I'm going to stop. So listen for that. I'll try and get the microphone as close as possible, but try and listen for that sound change. Right there, did you hear the sound change? Now we're rubbing against that little thin wafer of wood separating us from the other hole. So as soon as I hit that, I'm gonna stop the drill bit. Go ahead and take this out of the tailstock. All right, so I got my drill chuck and the forging bit out of the way, and if you look inside, you can see a tiny little hole where we punch through, and right now, you can hear how thin that sounds. So if I can push that out, you can hear those fibers breaking. So you can see we had just a tiny 1/16 of an inch wall thick piece in the middle. So I'm gonna break that out. I wanna stop as soon as I hit that, just so I don't go past it and go into my chuck jaws. I've seen guys do that and it gets really dangerous when that happens, as well as it ruins your equipment. So stop whenever you can. As soon as you hear that sound change, stop the lathe, move the piece, and we can go ahead and concave this surface out now. Make sure that spins freely. Bring my speed back up, and because I have a fairly light grip with the chuck jaws, I want to be a little more cautious than I was before when I knew I had a really good secure hold. So I want to make sure I don't have any catches now, because catches are usually when a piece will shift in the chuck and come out. So one other thing I'm going to do is just make sure my head's just slightly out of the way, out of the line of fire, just in case this does come out. Because if it does pop out, it's going to be shooting directly in line here. So make sure my face is out of the way, make sure my flute's closed and I'm on the bevel when I start the cut. And I'm not going to be doing any more peel cuts on the inside. The reason being is as I do a peel cut towards me right now, it's going up and the grain's unsupported, so it'll leave tear out. So I want to cut towards the center, that funnel, where the grain is all supported, and leave a clean cut. One other thing too is if your tools are dull, right now where you're trying to be fairly light and non-aggressive, you want to have as little friction on the piece as well. So you want a nice sharp cutting edge. So I'm going to go sharpen, I'll be right back. All right, now our tool is sharp. It should take less pressure to make the cut as well. Having a dull tool is like having a dull knife. It takes way more pressure to make the same amount of cutting action, and usually what will happen is you'll slip the tool off the piece or it'll catch on you. So sharp tools are a must. But you can see the curls we're getting, nice, really clean cuts. And one thing we'll talk about real quick is the shape. You can have as much or as little funnel as you want, depending on how good of a surface you have. If you have a nice, really clean surface like this, you don't need as much angle on the taper. If you're going to have a bunch of tear out or kind of a stickier finish, if you're going to go with a wax finish, you might want to have just a little more degree of taper to it so the change funnels towards the center a little easier. Because I'm almost at my final size here, I don't want to have a catch. So I'm making sure that flute's really closed over before I start the cut. All right, now that we're pretty close, I'm going to switch back to that smaller bowl gouge and give myself a final finishing cut. All right, I'm gonna stop the cut and move these shavings out of the way. I felt like they got between my bevel and the tool and it was preventing me from making that cut. So I'm gonna go ahead and pick it up right there and then ride that all the way towards the center. The nice thing about going to a smaller gouge is you're less likely to get tool marks from bevel contact, and it's a little easier to control on your cleanup cuts. So I'm gonna make one more pass. I'm gonna pick up the cut right here at the rim. And ride that all the way to the center. I'm making sure to put pressure down into the tool rest and not into the workpiece. I want to minimize as much bevel pressure as possible. All right, so I've got a really good degree of taper here, a very clean surface. That'll sand out with 320, no problem. But there is one negative here. Where the Forstner bit made the cut and made the hole here, there's tons of tear out. So let's show you how to clean that up. I'm going to bring up my tool rest and give myself as much support as possible. Get that tailstock out of the way so I've got handle room, clearance to move. You never want to be swinging your tool and hitting your tailstock. A lot of times that happens because I get lazy and I leave it there because I don't want to take it off the lathe or use the swing away, but that'll mess up your cut. So I'm going to switch to my spindle gouge because it's got that nice shallow bevel angle there, and I'm going to make a bevel riding cut on the inside wall here to clean that up. So I'm going to lean over the bedways. So I've got the handle swung away from my body because I want the bevel parallel to the bedways. And I've got my flute rolled over and nice and close because right now I have basically my finished surface here and I don't want to have a catch. So I'm going to make sure the flute's closed, initiate the cut. Once that bevel's riding, I'll open the flute slightly and then ride that all the way down. I'm going to start the cut again. And as I make this cut, I want to make sure I'm watching where the cutting edge is, so I know to stop as soon as I get to the back side of the surface. It's very easy to go past where you're cutting and hit those chuck jaws in there, so I'm making sure to make the cut stop as soon as I'm done at the edge of the wood on the inside. If I move the tool rest over and rotate this around, you can see we left a very clean surface. That'll sand out with 220, 320, and then we can go ahead and finish this piece, and we're about done. I'm going to turn my lathe on, bring that speed back down to about 800 RPM. I'm just going to move this out of the way, give us clearance for our drill. And because of the surface I have on there, I'm confident in sanding with 320. The disc holder helps even out that sanding pressure and helps us give us a really good surface as well. Go ahead and stop the lathe and take a look. I can see some very faint tool marks, so I'm going to actually drop down a grit. I'm going to go back to my 220 because it looks like a good surface, but there's just some minor tool marks right here and there I want to get out. All right, those tool marks are coming out now with the 220. So now that I got the tool marks out, I'm going to go to my 320 again. And then I'll grab my sheet paper and sand the inside of this drilled hole. Be careful when you're sanding, you don't want your finger to catch in there. because I turned unsupported grain at the very end of that piece, there's a little bit of a sharp lip on the back side, so I'm just going to rotate the paper over and sand that by hand just to soften up the inside edge there. Now I'm going to go to my 400 grit on the inside. If this hole was any smaller, I would say use a dowel or something to sand it. Because it's big enough, I'm not really worried about catching my finger. And then now we can burnish the surface with our non-woven pad. And then I want to remove my pencil marks as well up on the top, which I may need something just a little coarser than that. All right, last things last. Go ahead and chamfer this top rim to match the base. Bump that speed up so I get a clean cut. Just eyeball that chamfer to match the base. Then I'll grab my non-woven pad and just burnish that a little bit. I don't want to sand it. Now we can go ahead and get this out of the chuck. All right, so now we have that concave lid. Let's go ahead and test fit it. We got a nice pressure fit. Tight enough the base will stay on, but you can still pull it apart. Nice clean cuts. This piece is ready for some dye. All right, if you do have some chuck jaw marks on here, it looks like I have, where does that go? I've got just the tiniest little chuck jaw mark in there, but if they're worse than that, what you can do, I'm gonna go ahead and lock this and remove the chuck. So here's what you can do. Because we have a nice drilled hole in there and it's fairly square, you can mount this on these pin jaws. These happen to work really well. These are a nice cylinder shape on the exterior. You can go ahead and mount this up. Flip that around, sorry. And then you can go ahead and turn that if you do have any marks. If you don't have these jaws, you can turn a small dowel and jam fit it on there just like we did the base, and then you can go ahead and clean up that surface if you need to. Having this set of jaws, I actually use these quite a lot. Small projects, they're really nice because they have more of a rounded interior. So if you're doing tenons and dowels and stuff like that, it's a really good jaw to have. But I'm gonna go ahead and clean the lathe off, get rid of my tools because we're not gonna be using these anymore. All right, for this piece, you could go ahead and finish it out and do your standard traditional stuff you'd like to do to emphasize the maple grain. But I'm gonna actually dye this piece a nice chocolate color. I think it gives it a nice rich color to it, makes it look a little more expensive than just straight maple. So for that, I'll be using the artisan dye. This is the chocolate. So what I'll need, so I'm gonna grab some paper towels. If you're a little klutzy like me, make sure you throw some paper towels down on the lathe bed, just so you don't stain things, because this dye will stain the floor, it'll stain your clothes, it'll stain the lathe, so you want to be very careful with where this stuff goes. I'm also going to throw on some gloves. This dye is a alcohol base with some shellac content in there. It's a good dye. You can cut it back with denatured alcohol. You can also adjust how dark the color is by sanding it back. So you can play around with that if you'd like, or you can go ahead and finish it out the natural way. Just throw some oil on there, do some tried and true finish, whatever you like. But for this piece, I think this dye will make the grain pop and look pretty rich. So I'm going to saturate a pad, a paper towel, and then we're going to go ahead and just start wiping this on. I like using a paper towel to wipe it on. A lot of times if you just went and applied the dye straight into the piece, it might have more dye in one area than another, and then you have to kind of lighten it out to balance it. So having a nice little paper towel gives you more of an even surface, and it helps you get down into those corners as well. I can see down in the corners there's some areas that I'm missing some dye. Go ahead and saturate the pad. And this stuff dries extremely quickly because of the alcohol content, which is really nice. A lot of dyes might be water-based, which will raise the grain, which you don't want. Some other bases as well. Alcohol base tends to be the best because it's easier to blend the colors as well, especially if you're working with multiple colors on some lighter stuff like some blues and yellows, some reds and greens. So go ahead and apply this just in a circular motion here. And it will take the dye differently on the end grain versus the side grain. So we're hitting end grain right now, and you can see it's much darker than the side. Had I put on scratch free before I did this, I would want to get just some denatured alcohol and strip the surface just to remove any surface waxes that would prevent the dye from penetrating completely. Usually it's not an issue because this is a solvent, and that dye would usually melt away just from this alone, but it just helps to strip the surface. If you have areas that look splotchy, go ahead and get some more dye and try and blend them. The end grain areas will be darker no matter what, just because it's penetrating in the end grain instead of the side grain. Because the end here, the base of this is all side grain, I'm going to go ahead and just run a few drops of that in there and let that saturate and get into those grooves. Then we'll go ahead and wipe that around and try and blend it. Okay, and that's the base. So now let's go ahead and do the lid. All side grain, I'm not worried about where that's going to penetrate there. Let's go ahead and just let that run in. Get the inside of the drilled hole. All right, now that I have the lid and the base together, I'm going to line up the grain. That's the best grain there. So this way I've got the side grain and then the end grain kind of on the same sides. And then what we can do now is we can go ahead and try and blend these just a little bit. Now that they're together, put a fresh new coat on there and just try and soften those up. Okay, got a little bit excess on the rim there. Okay, so I'm going to set this rag aside to dry because it does have a flammable liquid in there. I want to make sure that dries out before we throw it in the trash. And now we go ahead and throw on our finish. Alright, so the finish I'll be using on this is the tried and true original. This has a beeswax in it as well as the boiled linseed oil, and that'll help emphasize the nice dye color we have on there and seal that into the wood. For the first coat, it's going to be a fairly wet coat. And then I'm going to leave it and let that penetrate for about an hour or two, and then I'll come back and wipe away any excess. I just want to go heavy on the first coat to let it saturate. And it won't take too much finish because the shellac in the dye will kind of seal off that wood fiber. And so we're not going to get too much finish penetrating here, but we want to make sure we're not undersaturating it. I want to make sure I get a good coat of finish on the first one. But you can see that tried and true really livens up that dye on the surface and gives us a good satin sheen. One of the favorite things I love about this finish is it has a really good pleasant smell to it. So I can use it indoors. It's non-toxic and I don't have to worry about fumes. I really like water locks as well, but that's so solvent based. And that's got a lot of flammable materials in it. That stuff I almost use only in the summertime when I can do it outside. But both good finishes, different options and different uses for both. But you can see how nice of a rich finish that gives us. Really makes that dye pop on the maple. Alright, so there's the base. Let's go ahead and get the lid, and then we'll go ahead and put this aside for a little while. The other thing too with this dye is if it's a little too dark for your taste, all it takes is a little bit of sandpaper to lighten the surface up, and then it gives you a completely different look. So the nice thing is we still have, you know, something you could mount on a tenon or you could jam chuck it. Same thing with the lid. Where a lot of projects are, like once they're done, you don't really want to remount them. This one you could definitely remount without causing too much damage to the surface. I'm going to go ahead and leave just a little bit heavier coat on this as well. Okay, so this is completely saturated. Go ahead and let it sit for an hour or two, and then we'll come back and wipe away any excess, and then we'll let it cure for 24 hours. So it's been about an hour. I can tell the wood fibers have definitely picked up a lot of that finish. I'm going to wipe away any of the excess finish, and then we can let it cure for 24 hours, and then you can apply subsequent coats if you want. So because it's a food safe finish, non-toxic, I don't need my gloves to wipe this down. The reason we wipe off the excess is I want a nice thin finish on the exterior. That'll give me a good even cure overnight. You can see we're picking up a little bit of dye, but that's a really good surface that leaves behind. Really rich finish, especially on the dyed maple. So go ahead and let that aside. Alright, I'll leave these aside for about 24 hours, and then we'll come back and give it a final wipe down and maybe a coat of wax, and then we'll be good to go. Alright, so now it's been 24 hours. These are fully cured. If you wanted to put more coats on for a little more protection, you can. I'm actually going to just be throwing on a coat of wax, something I can reapply over time as the change goes around in there and kind of damages the surface. So I want a little bit of protection. This is the goat finishing wax. It's a beeswax base, has a nice citrus smell to it, and just something that's easy to reapply. So I'm going to throw a quick coat of this on. This will just help protect the surface. Because we do have beeswax in that original tried and true, so this will go well with that. And then just buff this into the surface. Use the excess I have on the rag. Alright, now I'm going to flip to a clean side of paper towel and just buff this in. Get rid of any excess wax we have on the surface. Alright, so I'm going to put these two halves together, and that is our finished coin box. Have fun playing around with different designs and styles, but if you make some, tag us on social media. It's a fun modern design that makes storing your change nice and easy. It's a fun modern design that makes storing your change nice and easy. Damn it. It's a fun modern design that makes storing your change. Why is the intro so difficult, dude?